Greetings and welcome to the next topic of discussion for our strategic communication class. In this section, we'll be exploring crisis communication. We'll review some fundamentals of what constitutes a crisis and thinking about ways in which we can respond effectively to our key stakeholders. So I'm going to use a text called Communication and Organizational Crisis, written by Seeger, Selnow, and Ulmer. And I've used this text for about a decade. I've always tried to look at additional newer texts, but this one is probably the most comprehensive on the market as far as reviewing crisis from three distinct phases. So the authors suggest that organizations manage communication in a pre-crisis phase once there is a shift in routines or what they call a cosmological episode. Usually that leads to a bifurcation period that welcomes a crisis. And then, of course, the effective communication can allow an organization to move beyond a crisis phase into a post-crisis phase. But we're using that term crisis, and it might be helpful to offer a definition. The authors suggest that crisis involves sources of profound human loss and agony that are also factors in radical, rapid, and often positive social change. So crises, of course, can be devastating. Crises usually turn the organization in a way in which nothing will be the same again. But that can be beneficial, and generally, the loose interpretation of the Japanese symbol for crisis is destruction, but also renewal. If we think about some crises that have occurred in the United States in the last few years, we may have suggested that a horrible mass shooting may call attention to a possible revisiting of gun laws or some interpretations of the Second Amendment, or ways in which we might be able to keep our children and educational staff safe. Maybe that's a policy in which we start training more individuals in the schools, whatever it might be. And of course, that discussion could be political, but the point is that you're having it. You're leaning into the issue and you're trying to find a renewed way of preventing a crisis like that from occurring. Or maybe there was a disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in which a corporation decided to drill at a depth that had never been drilled before and caused the second largest environmental disaster in United States history. What was learned from that? Greater regulation, a moratorium on drilling for a period of time, and then, of course, a welcoming of renewable types of energy sources. But either way, there usually can be a silver lining to crisis. When we look at crises in an organizational context, Seeger, Selnow, and Ulmer explain this as an unexpected, non-routine event that creates high levels of uncertainty or threat to an organization's goal. And so this is the context in which we're going to focus specifically with our example. I have a short documentary to watch about the Tylenol crisis. But then, of course, as members of an organization, what can we think about or what can we do to try to help our organizations move past the crisis? To assist in that, in addition to the text, I thought it might be helpful to bring on some insight from the Public Relations Society of America. Now, PRSA for short is an enabling organization that trains and educates communicators in any number of different organizational contexts. But it also provides great resources and webinars for crisis communication. In a recent webinar, PRSA suggested there are a few tenets that organizations and their communicators should consider. The first crisis communication tenet suggests, how does a reasonable person expect a responsible organization to respond? Now, we're thinking about a reasonable person, meaning that it's not someone that's trying to induce outrage, but really it's someone who's level-headed and certainly part of a community in which an organization that may be responsible for a crisis exists. We also want to suggest that that term responsible is being used not as a synonym for culpable. So a culpable organization is, in fact, taking responsibility and should be blamed for causing the crisis. In this case, a crisis may not be the fault of an organization, but of course that organization needs to be responsive. So these are the two questions that this particular tenet addresses. What must be considered to attend to a reasonable person's expectations? And then, of course, what must be considered to characterize an organization as responsible? So for that first question, if we think about what's considered to be attentive to this responsible persons, then what does it mean for the organization to be part of the community? We can start there. Hopefully the organization in its existence has reached out to the community through a public relations effort that's based on authentic and genuine offerings. And so nothing that's perceived as a publicity stunt, but really being a sponsor of local 5Ks or making sure that there are foundations set up for those who want to know more about the organization, whatever it might be. And so that's sort of where the organization needs to attend to. These individuals have welcomed in the organization to a community, it's part of the community. So now how do we respond and attend to those reasonable person's expectations when the organization is experiencing a crisis? And then what must be considered to characterize an organization as responsible? Well, that's certainly the capacity to move forward in a public relations effort, one built on authentic relationship potential, not one built on publicity stunts or image management, but being part of the community. And so how an organization responds, we usually call crisis moments as reflective of contingent moments, meaning that either way, an organization is going to communicate. It probably needs to think reflectively and thoughtfully about what message to send when it is facing a contingent situation. An example that we've experienced at the University of Lynchburg looks at an issue that was had during a Halloween party, in which case criticism arose suggesting that a group of students were appropriating Mexican culture and essentially mocking the culture in the way in which they're presenting themselves, wearing the costumes that they believe were reflective of Mexican culture. And of course, this was a newsworthy item. It appeared in local news throughout Central Virginia. It may have even had national implications, but it placed the University of Lynchburg into a contingent situation. So going back to that first tenet, how does a reasonable person expect the university to respond? And then, of course, how does a responsible organization respond to this? One of the easiest ways that we can think about how to respond effectively is to build an argument using an Aristotelian argument structure. So if you look into the origins of rhetoric, it's difficult to not find yourself faced with a basic argument structure that initially was suggested as statement and proof. So from Aristotle's perspective, we'd offer a statement and then prove it. Of course, this was written well before the scientific revolution, so that P word proof had taken on different connotations over the course of history. So we've shifted it a little bit from statement and proof to claim and support. So an organization that's responding to a crisis can really say whatever it would like. But the bigger, the heavier lifting of that moment is to find support to the claim. And that's where the challenge enters into this rhetorical structuring, meaning that once the organization is speaking on behalf of individuals who may have been involved in this crisis, what types of evidence can you bring to support the claim? And so the good news was the University of Lynchburg has had a concerted effort toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also a clear mission that suggests that we need different routines and rituals and cultural artifacts to reflect this DEI effort. And so if we read through the statement that was articulated, I've outlined in red some of the language that can be supported. And so just take a minute and read through this. So earlier in the semester, we were looking at the importance of structuration theory and an organizational identity. So right here in this moment, we've been able to reflect on what was the core foundation of the organizational identity. And this particular facet was the DEI effort. And so the mission was articulate in suggesting that we need all operations to reflect education of students to thrive in a global society, one built on respect, one built on the values of the university. So in this contingent moment, the costumes, the appropriation were not reflective of the mission, and so we addressed that. I think Anthony Giddens would appreciate this response because it does follow the idea behind structuration theory, that if all of your communication channels and your actions are reflective of the mission, then even in a crisis moment, you'd be able to continue developing those channels and messages from the mission and be able to overcome this crisis. The second crisis communication tenet suggested from PRSA is that an incremental delay in responding to a crisis results in a greater than incremental impact on the organizational reputation. Now, this was challenging for many organizations because they want to respond. They have a good faith effort to respond. At the same time, it takes time to uncover details and discover information that can be disclosed in a crisis communication moment, in a statement. At the same time, it wants to make sure that all of those facts have been vetted and are accurate, but the audiences are waiting for some type of message. After all, it seems as though any type of delay will have a negative ramification on the organization's reputation. So one way in which the PRSA has suggested this can be remedied is for the organization to issue a holding statement. Now, this can be sent through a social media platform. I think Twitter or X, depending on what you want to call it, probably works very well. But the holding statement suggests this very simple message. We are aware of the crisis. Our thoughts are with those affected. We are responding in accordance to our values. And we will update you at 3 p.m. with more information. So this message sent through Twitter allows audiences to know that the organization is responding. It's becoming responsive. It's responsible. At the same time, it buys the organization time to begin to investigate and certainly coordinate a time in which the full statement can be issued, probably at a news conference. And so once we have enough information, depending on the magnitude of the crisis, we may want to think about calling a news conference to issue a formal statement. Now, to get that started, an organization can issue a media advisory. And the media advisory is just a 5 W's document that lets reporters, journalists, or other interested parties know that we are going to take a formal messaging stance on this crisis. So we can outline who is it that's sending the statement, what can be expected, where is it, when will it happen, and then of course the why. So this simple document sent to media, and then of course the organization can prepare the spokesperson to issue the formal statement that provides more detail than obviously what the holding statement was suggesting. The news conference can also be opened up for questions and answers. And of course, from a public relations point of view, it might be very helpful to train the spokesperson with some potential questions that journalists can ask in this moment with responses that will be reflective of the particular strategies. So depending on culpability, depending on what type of crisis you might be facing, that's going to have an influence over what it is that's being said. So to bring this full circle, I would like to watch a short documentary about one of the most well-known crisis communication efforts in modern history. And I'd like you to think about the nature of organizational crisis and if this organization was able to match or align itself with the 2 tenets that PRSA was suggesting.
The backlash over the ad was immediate.
To rebuild trust, corporations in trouble follow a familiar script.
I am deeply sorry.
This was a major breach of trust.
One written nearly 40 years ago when a deadly crisis gripped America.
The first to buy was the first to die.
Tylenol changed the crisis landscape.
But have all the lessons been learned?
Anger is boiling over on social media with the hashtag.
In 1982, I was 8 years old, and my mom had just gotten back from the maternity ward, went to the grocery store and bought Tylenol from the grocery store that was doctor's orders. And the next thing I knew, I just saw my mom go out on a stretcher from my upstairs window, and that was the last that I saw her.
Mary Reiner's Tylenol had been inexplicably spiked with poison.
3 people are dead, and another is in critical condition tonight.
One of the victims took the pills he bought to his home.
His brother and sister-in-law were so upset by his death that they went back to the house and took some Tylenol from the same bottle.
As the death toll hit 7, the terrifying randomness of the poisonings shocked the nation.
That bizarre mystery of Tylenol laced with cyanide still has not been solved tonight.
Investigators say they are searching for, quote, a madman.
People were terrorized. They didn't know what product they had in their home that could possibly be lethal if they ingested it.
Scared, really, that somebody could have tampered with some of the other products.
We had police riding around with their bullhorns, yelling, "Throw out your Tylenol, flush it down the toilet."
Do not take any Tylenol until further notice.
People were checking themselves into the ER, thinking they'd been poisoned.
I was just a nurse.
It was absolute chaos.
Flush it all down the wall, okay?
There's no single person, or even a group of single persons that stand out above the rest at this point in time.
We had no clues as to the motivation except the taking of human life. It made no sense. There was no clear and intended victim, but just anyone who happened to have the misfortune to buy a bottle of Tylenol.
Police are looking for disgruntled employees, angry customers, anybody with a grudge against the stores or Tylenol. Police are even checking stock transactions to see whether someone was trying to push down the value of Johnson & Johnson stock.
This was not a cockroach in the box kind of an issue. People had lost their lives. And that really created that vulnerability, that sense of risk, that sense of threat that I think really scared a lot of people, and justifiably.
Alan Hilberg worked for Johnson & Johnson's outside public relations firm, one that was increasingly focused on a new type of business, crisis management.
I remember asking lots of questions. The conversation was, well, we need to recall. Okay, do we recall from the store? Do we recall from the city? Do we recall from the region?
All the bottles of extra-strength capsules were removed Friday as part of the nationwide recall.
Now, not only is extra-strength Tylenol off the shelves, Tylenol commercials are off the air.
The race is on for Tylenol's competitors.
They didn't worry about the money. They didn't worry about the impact on the company. They stopped shipment, ordered all their distribution chain to pull it back in so that we could figure out what was going on. And that sticks out in my mind. It was not a negotiation or discussion. In fact, they stepped forward and volunteered it.
Some analysts predict the Tylenol brand name will disappear within a year.
We concluded we were never going to be judged by what caused the problem. We were always going to be judged on how we responded to it.
Meanwhile, the criminal investigation seemed stuck in first gear.
The 130-man, multi-million-dollar investigation, according to sources, hasn't lifted a promising fingerprint.
We did receive hundreds, indeed thousands, of tips and would investigate and run down every single one of those tips.
A stolen car with Tylenol in it, the body of a man found with Tylenol in a coat pocket. There were reports of a Tylenol shoplifter.
We got there, we said, "Now where did you get this information?" And she says, "I have a magic pen, and it made me write these things out, and I've told you about it."
Hundreds of leads to the cyanide killer, but most of them bum and bizarre.
Then there was a new development, an extortion letter threatening to do it again.
Authorities today stepped up their search for the man accused of demanding $1 million from the makers of Tylenol to prevent further murders. The extortion letter, when received, was an obvious point of interest to the law enforcement authorities. James Lewis is said to have made that demand.
He maintained as many as 20 aliases and described himself variously as a salesman, computer specialist, importer, and freelance writer.
We were trying to determine whether or not the person that sent the letter was indeed the one that had put the cyanide in all the capsules, or whether it was just some lookalike or screwball taking advantage.
Common sense would tell you this is an important thing that we are looking at.
As the police searched for Lewis, Johnson & Johnson grappled with a $100 million recall and the future of one of its most lucrative brands.
The question became, how do we regain trust? It wasn't in the efficacy of the medicine. Tylenol works. Trust was lost in the packaging because the packaging had enabled the poison, the cyanide, to be entered into the medicine.
6 weeks to the day since the Tylenol murder story broke, Johnson & Johnson held a news conference in New York to reintroduce Tylenol.
Tylenol capsules.
It had the cotton ball, it had aluminum over the top, it had a childproof cap, it had plastic over the childproof cap. Those levels of safety became the levels of trust.
I think they're going the extra mile to make it sure that it's consumer safe.
Tylenol, the so-called 8th victim of this tragedy, is continuing to recover.
That business turnaround, one analyst calls the greatest comeback since Lazarus.
Packaging now had become a competitive advantage. Everything from food products to pharmaceuticals were favorably affected.
If I take the cap off the milk carton, you have to stick your finger in there and grab the ring and pull the ring out along with the seal. I think of Tylenol, still to this day.
Today, although crisis management has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, Hilberg says many companies seem to miss an important lesson. Come clean with the public right away.
We're seeing too many examples of companies, whether it's Volkswagen or Wells Fargo or Equifax, where situations actually exacerbate simply because they forgot the lesson that you're going to not be judged by what caused the crisis, but by how you respond.
Johnson & Johnson has also stumbled since the Tylenol case. In 2010, it faced a public backlash after a series of drug recalls, including one the company conducted without letting regulators or consumers know.
Mr. Chairman, I know that we let the public down.
The single most important metric of a company's value is trust. And that's what crises threaten. They threaten trust.
Faced with worldwide outrage over these images showing a passenger forcibly removed from a plane, United Airlines CEO issued his third apology on Tuesday.
You said you were sorry. Where are you going from here? That's how I'm going to judge whether I trust you or not.
Almost 40 years after the Tylenol murders, the case remains unsolved. While Lewis served 12 years in prison for the attempted extortion of Johnson & Johnson, he has long denied any involvement in the tampering, and no one has ever been charged with the deadly crime.
Lewis made himself a suspect because he tried to shake down money, with the implication being that he had done it and wouldn't do it again. But we had several other suspects, none of which would answer the question of why, and there was no direct link as to the indiscriminate taking of life.
The investigation continued.
There was no evidence to pin it on anybody at that time, and there still hasn't been any evidence to pin on anyone. So that's where this all stands. It's the perfect crime.
So in evaluating the Tylenol response, we can review those two tenets in which Alan Hilberg, the coordinator behind the messaging, suggested how does a reasonable person expect a responsible organization to respond? And certainly Tylenol was able to respond effectively by not holding itself as culpable, but the trust between the organization and the audience was lost. And so Hilberg was able to talk about how the packaging became the metaphor for regaining trust. And the second tenet, the incremental delay, results in a greater than incremental impact on trust, on reputation of the organization. And so Tylenol was able to lean into this challenge pretty much immediately, and within the 6 weeks, develop the package and reintroduce it to the market. So both tenets were satisfactorily, adequately met. And of course, if you look into this crisis further, you would see that the actual message was informed by Tylenol's credo. So another way of suggesting the mission of Tylenol was always putting the customer first. And that's why it had such an extensive nationwide recall, even though this is an isolated incident in Chicago. So smart communication strategy, helpful alignment of the response to the two tenets, overall successful case study for crisis communication.